Now, the British economy, our great economy, it has a deadly, deadly addiction. That's the harsh truth. It's the drug of cheap overseas labour. And this drug, it's being pushed on every street corner by the Labour Party and by the Tories. They believe that this drug, this addiction, is good for the British economy. Let me tell you, today, it's not. And what we need is a cure to this addiction. And the cure is an employer immigration tax. That is the cure to this addiction. Smart immigration, highly qualified, highly skilled, can be a great thing. But there's a price to it. There's a cost to it. And the truth is, at the moment, there's no cost to big business for employing cheap, low-skilled, overseas labour. There's no cost for training, there's no cost for infrastructure, there's no cost for housing, there's no cost for health, there's no cost for transport, and the list goes on. So they're getting away without paying for overseas labour. That cost is borne by the British taxpayer. And the truth is that no other main party will tell you is that that is simply unfair. And what's the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that we have lower wages for British workers. British wages are depressed by mass immigration from overseas. And again, I put it to you that that is simply unfair. And it's particularly unfair for young British people, youngsters leaving school, leaving university. That's where it's unfair. Now, if I take you back to the 1980s and the 1990s, yes, I'm old enough to remember, we had real growth, GDP growth, of 2.5% to 3.5% per year. Yes, if it was less than 2%, people would get worried. If it was less than 1%, people thought it was a moral recession. Now the Chancellor gets excited at 0.5%. But here's the real point. We didn't have mass immigration in those 2 decades. And I'll give you the example of the 1990s. Real wage growth for British workers was about 2.8% every year. We're amongst friends. Let's call that 30% over a decade. But in the decade leading up to the Brexit referendum in 2016, there was zero real wage growth. Surprise, surprise, that was the first real decade of significant rising immigration leading to what's happened in the last few years, where the Tories, after Brexit, they betrayed every promise they made to the British people, to ordinary workers, when they said we're going to bring the immigration numbers down and that'll help wage growth, and they did the opposite. They absolutely opened all the doors. So now we've got some 2.5 million people arrived in the UK in just the last 2 years alone, with no price, no premium paid. And so that actually has a cost to the British taxpayer. And it's simply unfair. So what we need to do is we need to incentivize business to say, actually, if you want to employ people from overseas, that's fine, but you've got to pay a price for it. An employer immigration tax, because actually we want to incentivize you to employ British workers. Now, big business will say, oh, come on, Richard, British workers don't want to work, to which I say, nonsense. Before the era of mass immigration, in the 1980s and the 1990s, British workers were working, and we had real wage growth. So maybe, actually, it's you, big business, getting away without paying a decent working wage. So what happens is that big business makes ever bigger profits because ordinary workers receive lower wages. And here's basic economic theory. Literally since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, The basic economic theory, it's A-level economics. If you increase the supply of something, the price of that supply, in this case, wages, labour, the price of that goes down. Whereas if you limit the supply of it, guess what happens? The price goes up. And if businesses say, well, I can't afford the wages, then guess what happens? They invest in capital equipment to create more productivity. But our investment in capital and productivity is falling. It's a disaster. And the reason is, it's too easy to be addicted to that drug on every street corner of cheap overseas labour. So how will an employer immigration tax work? Well, here it is, and it's actually very straightforward. Look, if you want to employ people, non-British passport holders, then we think it's perfectly reasonable that you pay a premium on national insurance. So actually what you should pay is national insurance of 20%, as opposed to 13.8%. It's about a 45% increase. We think that is a perfectly reasonable premium to pay. Now, of course, there should be an exemption for very small businesses, 5 people and under. And of course, there should be an exemption for healthcare and social care. That's the right thing to do. But here's what will happen. This will actually change people's thoughts and behaviour. We believe over one electoral cycle that this employer immigration tax will raise over £20 billion. Varies, of course, depending on how quickly employers adjust their recruitment processes. But £20 billion in one electoral cycle. Now, you might be pretty astonished that Reform UK, known as a party of creating high growth, reducing taxes, making work pay, you might say this is a bit unusual. Let me tell you what it is. It's fair. It's the right thing to do. Because what we need to do is we need to invest in apprenticeships, in young people, in training, in employing young people, in motivating, in developing. All of these things that have disappeared because there was no incentive for business to invest in young British workers. This is the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. Now, I know lots of people will say, hang on, Richard, you're going to destroy growth. No, we're not. There are 9.2 million people here in the UK that are economically inactive. There are well over 5 million people that are on out-of-work benefits. So don't tell me there's a shortage of labour. I think for too many people, work doesn't pay. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to overcome this addiction. Now, choice is a good thing. And businesses might say, well, actually, I really want that person over there. I'm happy to pay the price. That's fine. That is smart immigration. It works. You've got the option, you pays your money, you take your choice. But if you want to bring in people from overseas, then there's a price to that. Because this great country of ours, this incredible nation, we've all paid for it over decades and decades. So it's not unreasonable to expect you to chip in a bit. Now, I know the lefties, I mean, they'll whinge, they'll whine, they'll bleat. There's a surprise. They'll call me all sorts of names and that it's discriminatory. Frankly, my response to them is grow up. I think the vast majority of ordinary are sick of this pathetic identity politics that is designed purely to smear and suppress debate and discussion. I know some people want to talk about immigration, but what we want to talk about in Reform UK, and what I want to talk about, is how we get this country growing again, and how we help young British workers have motivation, get on the housing ladder. It's not fair, as I've said before, that because of mass immigration, housing rents, particularly for young people, have increased just in the last 2 years alone by over 20%. We think this is the right thing to do. But of course, Labour and the Tories, they're literally two sides of the same socialist coin. Why are they addicted to this drug? Is it because actually They want to cosy up to big businesses. You've got droves of MPs from both parties leaving Parliament. What are they going to do? Oh, funny that. They're all looking for cosy non-exec directorships on these boards of these big companies. That's the conflict of interest that they've got. They're the globalists. They are for the big multinational corporations. They're not for the British worker. And so it's Reform UK that actually is on the side of British workers. Interestingly, trade unionists agree with me. But of course, the unions themselves, well, they have to do the bidding of Starmageddon and the Labour Party. That's the truth. This is the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. The truth is, folks, it's only Reform UK that has a serious plan to reform the United Kingdom, to reform our economy. And this is a key part of it. It's time for an employer immigration tax. It's time for change. And this election on July the 4th, it's time for reform. It's also time to welcome my good friend, who I've worked with, campaigned with for many, many years. And we're looking forward to campaigning again throughout this election period. It's exciting. Sometimes, we never know quite what's going to happen next. But that's part of the excitement. I love campaigning. Knocking on doors, all of that, when people welcome you. And let me tell you what is out there. My good friend knows it, and I know it. Do you remember the old shy Brexiteers? There's a whole load of shy reformers. They're out there. Every day I meet them. That little sort of thumbs up, wink, don't tell anyone. That's why we're going to do so much better than everybody predicts on July the 4th. And that's why with my good friend Nigel, we are going to surprise everybody, because this great country of ours needs reform. So I'm going to hope that the doors will open, and my good friend Nigel will emerge. Here he is.
Thank you, Richard. Good. Excellent. Very good. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And Richard, well done. That is a bold, innovative policy. I can hear the multinationals wailing already, because you're quite right. We have become addicted to cheap foreign labour. We're 1 week into the campaign. Gosh, it's going well, isn't it? I mean, who's leading in the polls at the moment? Well, winning by a country mile is none of the above. And it's not particularly surprising, because nothing slippery Sunak says is believable. And as for Starmer, I try and listen to his speeches. I try and focus on what he's saying, and I simply zone out after a few minutes. In fact, the campaign is so dull that the Daily Mail today's big front page is about the disappearance of Lord Lucan, who went 50 years ago, and I think that pretty much says where we are with all of this. But it isn't just the personalities that are dull, it's the lack of real substance on debate. On economics, I literally can't tell them apart, and we'll be talking more about the economy, Richard and I, next week. But the really big elephant in the room, of course, is the subject of legal immigration. Now, of course, there's been huge focus on what's happened in the English Channel over the course of the last 4 years, and rightly so. And we talked about that in Dover the other day. But the subject that the two big leaders do not wish to discuss at all is legal immigration. You see, nobody in this country was ever offered the opportunity to vote for mass immigration. In no election manifesto were people promised that many millions more would come. And just to give it a bit of historical context, if we go right back to Windrush, and we go all the way through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, until Blair came to power, net migration into Britain through that whole period of time averaged 30 to 40,000 people a year. Some years it was a little bit higher, some years it was virtually zero. And we could have said 25 years ago that of all the countries in Europe, we without doubt had the best levels of integration of immigrants into Britain, certainly compared to France, Germany and many other countries. But something changed with Labour, whether it was just willfully wishing to rub the noses of the right in diversity, I don't know. But the doors began to open. And indeed, it was the Blair government and those decisions to open the doors that directly led to the Brexit referendum result. Up until then, talking about leaving the European Union was considered to be a fairly minor constitutional issue, but how does it affect me, Governor? Suddenly, everything changed. So that uncontrolled mass immigration period meant that from 97 to 2010, we had a net inflow of about 2.7 million people. I mean, an absolutely astonishing number. But it was all going to be okay, because we were promised in the 2010 manifesto. We were promised in the 2015 manifesto. We were promised in every single manifesto, including up to 2019. To begin with, they told us net migration would be tens of thousands a year. And in 2019, they talked about raising the barriers, raising the levels at which people could come to make sure we would not be reliant on cheap, unskilled labour. Well, since the Conservatives have been in power, net migration is running at about 4.3 million. So Labour opened the doors, and the Conservatives simply accelerated that trend. And they somehow think they can get away with it because the electorate haven't noticed. Well, they have. And I really do believe that this should be the immigration election. You see, if you ask voters what are their priorities, well, the subject of immigration on its own has gone from about fifth 3 or 4 months ago to second or third, depending which pollster you look at. So what are the big priorities of the electorate? Well, cost of living clearly is one of them. What greater cost of living is there for the average family, for an ordinary folk in this country, than the cost of either renting a property or the cost of buying a property? It is the biggest capital outlay that people face. Now, I was doing my best in 2015, in the general election, to draw an argument that said a massively increasing population meant we had housing shortages, and nobody to listen. But things have changed. Economic report out just 10 days ago, saying that the cost of rents was up by nearly 30% directly as a result of the population explosion. And think about housing itself. Need to build one new property every 2 minutes just to accommodate current levels of net migration. Think about that. One new property we have to build every 2 minutes just to cope with current levels of net migration. We're told more broadly people are concerned about the economy. And of course, GDP. We bow down to the god of GDP. GDP is going up, therefore immigration, mass immigration, is good for the economy. No. If you have more people in the country, it'd be surprising if GDP didn't go up. But what really matters is GDP per capita, and that is falling. What that actually means is that the average family, in relative terms, are getting poorer, and that mass immigration is one of the direct reasons and direct causes of that problem. But it's good for business, we're told. It's good for business. Well, if that's the case, why have our productivity levels sunk to a level that is almost unimaginable? And I say that because our productivity is now below that of France. And given what I know of the French work ethic, I find that very, very difficult to believe. So it doesn't work at any level. Ah, but the NHS, we're told. The NHS, that matters to people enormously. Well, of course it does, as we pump in ever more money and get worse and worse returns. But even there, a population of increase of 10 million people ever since Tony Blair came to power has put intolerable burdens on the NHS. And I genuinely believe that out there in the country, people are beginning to join the dots. They're beginning to understand the population explosion that we're going through is actually leading to a decline in the living standards of pretty much everyone that lives in this country. We are not, as a party, and no party I've ever been part of, anti-immigration. We understand that high-skilled migration into Britain can lead to economic benefits, but we are totally opposed to what has happened over the course of the last 25 years. We are confident that a clear majority of the British public feel exactly the same way as we do on this issue. We are certain that they have never, ever been asked properly at an election whether this is what they want. And who knows, if people start to understand what Reform UK is all about, and let's face it, we're a very new party. We don't have a big brand identity yet out there with the British public. But if over the course of the next few weeks, people start to hear about us, start to see what we stand for, start to actually, we want to stand up for all, not, as in this case, the giant multinationals, then we might just surprise everybody over the course of the next 5 weeks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nigel. So we're going to take some questions. We'll start with the broadcasters. GBNews, I think, are here. Mark White, do you want to kick off the Q&A? Hopefully you've got a microphone there.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon.
Hi. Is it on? Try it. Give it a tap.
1, 2, 3. Hi.
Very good.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us along. With regard to this policy to try to tax employers coming across, how can you ensure that what you're not doing is taxing small businesses who desperately need a certain skilled labour from overseas, and also the health and social care sector, who rely very significantly at the moment on overseas workers?
Yeah, no, great question, Mark. Thank you. Try again. Look, on health and social care, we've already said that there would be an exemption for that. Even the dog enjoys it. So there'd be an exemption for health and social care. And look, at the end of the day, businesses have got to make a choice. This is to create an incentive for all businesses above 5 workers to actually say, well, yes, if you can only find someone from overseas, understand that, that's a choice, but there's a cost to it. There's a price to it for the infrastructure for all of us, because all of us, over decades, we've all paid for it. So, and it's right, because in the 1980s and the 1990s, before mass immigration, we had much higher growth in GDP and also in real wage growth. That's not a coincidence. That's because actually, if there was a labour shortage, people invested in capital equipment. And so you had higher wage growth, higher productivity. And that's what's been missing. It's directly linked, but no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to admit it, except Reform UK. And that's why it's absolutely essential. So look, smart immigration, it's a great thing. The key to good immigration, smart immigration, is both integration and paying a fair price. And that's what we're saying. Who's next? Have we got our broadcast friends at Sky, perhaps?
Hi, thanks for having us along. Nigel, yesterday you gave an interview in which you said that you would be open to having a conversation with the Tory party. You said, what are they going to do back for me? So what would you like the Conservatives to do for you? Are you open to having some sort of deal with them? Would you join the Conservative Party? And Richard, what do you make of all of this?
This was a deeply sarcastic answer given to Harry Cole, the political editor of The Sun, on his new programme, Never Mind the Ballots, just to give you some context of where it was. And it's the old thing. I've been asked this for 25 years. For 25 years I've been asked, what are you going to do for the Conservatives? Why don't you stand aside? He's a frightfully good chap, you know. He was an Eton, really, he was. And actually, I think in 2019, we did the Conservatives the biggest favour anyone's ever done them. With the complete catastrophe of the May Premiership, we formed the Brexit Party, and within 6 weeks, we reduced the Conservatives to their most humiliating election result in nearly 200 years. And that led directly to Theresa May going. That was the first bit of very significant help that we gave the Conservatives in 2019. The second was perhaps more significant, and that was we withdrew 319 candidates because we frankly couldn't bear the thought of a Corbyn Lib Dem SNP coalition, a second referendum, an unpatriotic Prime Minister. We couldn't bear the thought of it. So in the interest of the country, we stood aside. That helped enormously, because it gave the nod, didn't it? It's OK to vote for Boris. It's OK to vote for the Conservatives in this election. But what has happened since then? And I touched on it earlier. The reason we got the Brexit result was that mass immigration was, hey, wait, hang on a second, this doesn't make sense. Right? That's why we got the result. That's why the turnout in the referendum was as high as it was. And be in no doubt, millions of those voters that voted for Boris Johnson had previously voted for UKIP and the Brexit Party. We were like a gateway drug through from Labour. And one of their primary concerns was over levels of immigration. They feel betrayed by the Conservative Party. I feel betrayed by the Conservative Party. I have absolutely no interest of any kind at all in doing anything with them. As I say, my reply was deeply sarcastic. You know, what are they ever going to give me? Well, the answer is 3/5 of 5/8 of very little. There is no deal with the Conservatives whatsoever.
And as I said on Radio 4 this morning...
There we go. That was Nigel Farage responding to a question just there over a potential deal with the Conservatives. He suggested, talking to the Sun newspaper last night, that he could be on for a deal. He now claims that what he said to the Sun's political editor, Harry Cole, was sarcastic.